Our top story, a Maui doctor facing life in prison for allegedly trying to kill his wife is trying to get his case thrown out. Ali'i Duklo sifted through court documents and has an explanation from the defense team.
Nearly a year after Gerhardt Konig allegedly tried to push his wife off a cliff, his attorney says key evidence is flawed and prosecutors made serious errors.
He's doing his job. Defense counsel is doing exactly what he was retained to do.
While Gerhardt Konig remains in jail without bail, his defense lawyer Thomas Otake filed 2 motions on Monday to dismiss Konig's attempted murder charge. The anesthesiologist is accused of trying to push his wife Ariel off the Pali Lookout trail while the couple was vacationing on Oahu for her birthday last March. Konig also allegedly bashed her head with a rock and tried to stick her with a syringe. Otake says leading to Konig's grand jury indictment, the state withheld details from HPD's physician report. In those forms, Otake says 2 doctors concluded Ariel's injuries did not create a substantial risk of death.
The law does require the government to produce any exculpatory evidence to the grand jury because it's a matter of fairness.
Leading to the charge, Otake also says the state used inadmissible triple hearsay evidence to imply Konig confessed to the attack. The alleged admission was referenced by a Honolulu detective that was testifying about a report from Maui police. In that report, Konig's son allegedly told an MPD detective that Konig FaceTimed him from the hike and confessed. But because Konig's son was on the mainland and never testified in person,
And without him being on the stand to clearly testify to what, if anything, Dr. Konig said, I think it misleads the grand jury.
It's an issue if the detective who comes to testify doesn't say exactly or pretty much exactly what the witness they're paraphrasing says.
If neither of the motion's claims hold on their own, Otake argues both combined would warrant a dismissal. Meanwhile, a second motion argues that prosecutors did not identify how Konig specifically tried to kill his wife, either the push, syringe, or rock.
The second motion that they filed was really about due process and the language of the complaint really not being enough.
Ariel claims Konig accused her of cheating and has since filed for divorce and obtained a restraining order. Her attorney declined comment today. A hearing on the motions is set for next month. Ali'i Duklo, Hawaii News Now.